All right, folks. I just want to take a little bit of a moment to talk a little bit about some prenatal development things. And in particular, I'd like to focus on two things that are not really covered well, or I guess kind of in depth in the text. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about them. The first is teratogens, and the second one is FASD. So, when we are talking about teratogens, what we're talking about are any substances that can harm the fetus during development. Um, Now, teratogens don't always harm the fetus directly, but they're more likely to do so when they occur in larger amounts, for longer time periods, and during the more sensitive phases of development. Now, the most vulnerable period for many of the fetal organs is very early in the pregnancy, before the mother even knows that she is pregnant. Now, one of the things that is very difficult for us is the reality that children born into poverty are more likely to be exposed to teratogens. And I'll talk about that more in just a little bit here. But before kind of going ahead, I wanted to just show you this little chart here about kind of the period um, the time period, I guess, of development for when different things, different major structures are being developed. And so, what we know is that exposure to teratogens, particularly very early, between weeks 3, 4, 5, and 6, during the embryonic period, are usually very detrimental to and may lead to major structural abnormalities for a child. So, I mean, the central nervous system is basically being developed, during week 3. I mean, that's when the groundwork is set up for all of the major structures that develop from it. And so, the goal here is to really just kind of show you just what I guess just how harmful early exposure to teratogens is to the embryo. Now, there are so many different types of teratogens that we can talk about. So one of them is genetic mutations from either mom or dad. So we know that birth defects due to gene mutations that occurs in about 20%, or chromosomal abnormalities that occurs in about 5 to 10% of live births. Different symptoms like Down symptom, Patau syndrome, Edwards, Angelman, all of these syndromes are really forms of genetic mutations that are inherited um, from either one or both of the parents. We also know exposure to different diseases during this time period, during this sensitive time period, can be very detrimental to the development of the fetus. So things like German measles, rubella, varicella, things that we have normally are vaccinated against, but that are kind of on the rise in many areas because of a lack of vaccination for many people. We know that things like radiation, pollution, and toxic substances are also very responsible um, for kind of mutations. So things like lead paint, mercury exposure, herbicides, industrial solvents. Now, just a slide ago, I talked about the fact that poverty is correlated with more exposure to teratogens. Well, in many apartment buildings, especially in the United States, lead paint has actually not been removed from many of these apartments, especially in lower income areas. And so that is a major contributing factor for teratogen exposure for pregnant mothers. And it's a very unfortunate thing because it's something that we can do something about. Sexually transmitted infections during this time period can also harm the developing fetus, in particular HIV, syphilis, or genital herpes at the time of delivery are all forms of teratogens that have a negative impact on the fetus. Drugs, both legal and illegal, as well as alcohol, are also teratogens, and these lead to structural abnormalities as well as FASD. Drugs should be avoided, especially during the first trimester. And when I'm talking about drugs here, I am not talking about illicit drugs. I'm actually talking about legal drugs, medication, over the counter drugs. Where possible, they should be avoided, especially during that first trimester, which is, in general, a sensitive period of development. And if you have to take medication, take the lowest dose possible. We don't really think about this, but cigarettes is actually also a teratogen. And one of the interesting things that longitudinal studies have found is that, for example, for women who smoke, there is an increased risk of miscarriage as well as premature birth. For babies that are born, they tend to be of lower birth weight. Oftentimes, they have an abnormal fetal heartbeat. Later on in life, they often have symptoms surrounding hyperactivity or learning disabilities, asthma, or in some cases, antisocial behavior. We also know that maternal health factors can lead to or can act, I guess, as a form of teratogen. So, for example, prenatal diabetes or maternal phenylketonuria, all of these diseases that the mother is experiencing can also have an impact on the developing fetus. Finally, maternal stress is um, a large teratogen that we're only just beginning to understand just um, how impactful stress is during that prenatal period. So maternal stress during the prenatal period. And this can look as, in the form of relationship distress, financial distress, or social isolation. That all of these things lead to or exacerbate maternal stress as one is preparing for having a baby. Now, I've talked a little bit about about alcohol being a form of teratogen. It's important, though, to talk a little bit about something that has gotten a lot more attention in recent years, and that's this idea of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, or FASD. So back in the day, we used to call it FAS or FAE, so fetal alcohol syndrome or fetal alcohol effects. The new term is that it's a fetal alcohol spectrum of disorders. So each year in Canada, approximately 9 babies in every 1,000 are born with FASD. And FASD, in its broadest sense, is a collection of disorders that are related to prenatal alcohol exposure. Now, this is an important thing to say over and over again because the reality is there's no safe amount or safe time to drink alcohol during pregnancy. The best approach for all expectant mothers is to avoid alcohol use completely during the prenatal period. Now, there's also some research coming out that suggests that fathers, especially during the time of conception, should also avoid alcohol. But that's something that we will not cover in this course in great detail. Now, how do we diagnose FASD? Now, there are some important things that for us we need to know. So first of all, that there is known or presumed prenatal alcohol exposure. And so when I'm talking about presumed alcohol exposure, that means that we have reliable evidence, if not directly from the birth mother, but from others who would be reliable sources that there was prenatal alcohol exposure. This is not a requirement, especially if there are some of the facial features that are present for FASD. The other component that we need is something that we call pervasive brain dysfunction. And so that's when we're seeing severe impairment in 3 or more neurodevelopmental domains. And I'll show you what those are in a minute. This diagnosis is also not come to by one person. It usually occurs as part of a multidisciplinary assessment that involves a pediatrician or physician, a psychologist, speech-language pathologist, and occupational therapist, as well as others who may have important insight into that particular child. So what is pervasive brain dysfunction? Well, basically there are kind of 11-ish areas where we would tend to see brain dysfunction. So that would be in motor skills. So I'm talking about fine motor and gross motor skills. So the little motor skills like writing or cutting with scissors, or larger motor skills like jumping, running, climbing. We would expect to see pervasive brain dysfunction in the areas of neuroanatomy or neurophysiology, so that there are actual physical structural changes to the brain. So that's something that we would see through MRI or a similar type of neuroimaging type of study. We would expect to see dysfunction in areas of cognition, so that would be things like intelligence or cognitive potential, problem-solving abilities. Delays in language, academic achievement, memory. And so when we're talking about memory, we're looking at things like working memory. So how much information can you hold in your mind for a short period of time before forgetting it? Or we could also be looking at things like long-term memory. So, how easily can you learn, remember new things, and how easily can you retrieve that when you need that? Looking at challenges in areas of attention. And when we're talking about attention, we're talking about focused attention. We may also expect to see challenges in executive function, so that would include areas like impulse control and hyperactivity. difficulties managing emotions, so affect regulation, as well as difficulties with adaptive behavior, social skills, or social communication. So we need to see significant deficits. And so when I'm talking about significant deficits, we would be looking at scores on standardized tests that are at least 2 standard deviations or more below the mean, which would indicate significant challenges in these particular areas. Now, when it comes to FASD diagnoses, there are basically 3 types. The first one is what we call FASD with sentinel facial features. And so in this case, that we either have known or unknown prenatal alcohol exposure, that there are the presence of these specific facial features, and I'll show you a picture of that in a second. And then we see impairment in 3 or more of the developmental domains that I just mentioned to you. So when we talk about FASD, we do know that there are very unique facial features that are often associated with it. And so the reason why in some cases prenatal alcohol exposure doesn't need to be known is because of the fact that these facial features are only associated with prenatal alcohol exposure and no other teratogen. And so this is just a little bit of an image of some of the differences that we tend to see in children with FASD. The other diagnosis would be that there's FASD without these sentinel facial features. So there's no facial dysmorphia, but we do know that there's prenatal alcohol exposure. And then the third diagnosis is not really a diagnosis, it's a designation. So that's when we know that there's been prenatal alcohol exposure. At that time, we don't see neuropsychological impairment, or the assessment is just inconclusive because the child is too young, or we just don't have all the information that we need at this moment in time in order to make that designation. And so this is kind of how it kind of falls, I guess, at the diagnostic level. Now, I'd also like for you to know that there is more information that's available for you regarding FASD. I would encourage you to check out the Centers for Disease Control website. There's a link for you there that can show you a little bit more information, as well as the FASD Network of Saskatchewan, which provides awesome opportunities for training, for frontline staff, for parents, and for educators. And that also is a significant support source in our province that helps people who either have a diagnosis of FASD or who need support to manage some of those challenges. So I'm going to pause here for a minute and we'll pick